Welcome. We are at the Global Listening Festival, and I am Gayle Pohl from the University of Northern Iowa. And I am so excited because you are about to listen to a listening panel. And we have fantastic authorities from different areas of disciplines. And they're going to talk about their perspectives on listening. This should be a really exciting panel. I'm excited, and I hope you're excited too. So come join us and listen attentively, because this is the listening panel. Now, folks, we have 4 fantastic experts, and I would like for you to introduce yourselves and first tell us what your discipline is or your job.
Great. Hi, I am Danielle McGeough, and I am a professor in the area of performance studies.
I am Joanne Wzontek. I am the development director at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art, and I concentrate on development and fundraising.
I'm Joe Gorton. I'm an emeritus professor of criminology from here at the University of Northern Iowa.
And I'm Marty Hansen. I am assistant professor of practice in the Wilson College of Business, where I teach a variety of sales management classes, all stuff that involves a lot of listening.
That's fantastic. As you can see, variety of practices, and I'll tell you from experience, they're talkers. Now, my first question is, can you provide all of us an example of when listening contributed to building trust or improving a professional relationship in your respective fields? Anyone want to hop in on that one?
Well, my whole profession, the sales world really does involve building trust. We teach relational selling, so I expect salespeople to be really, really good listeners, because without great listening skills, they're not going to be able to really get deep inside the customer, the prospect, and understand what their real problem is. And then sales, it's all about solving people's problems. And listening and asking great questions are really what makes for a successful salesperson, in the field.
Joe, can I juxtapose that answer with what you do in criminology?
Well, I think in my work there are 2 areas where this question applies. One is, I spend a lot of time training students in the area of correctional treatment. So as, for instance, being probation officers, parole officers, correctional counselors, and also how to work in the area of interrogations for criminal offenders. And so what I really try to emphasize is that in all of those arrangements, whether you're interrogating a suspect or interviewing someone who just got out of prison and you're trying to help them get a footing and back into the community, the most important thing that you really have to do is build trust. And if you're not listening, that's not going to happen. And with a lot of people, especially people who have been incarcerated for a long time, they become really good at reading people. It becomes sort of how you survive in some of America's prisons, and they're reading you, right? And so if you're not listening, if you're not paying attention, you're sort of dialing it in, they can tell. And so part of what I emphasize is the hard work of listening. And also in professional relationships, which my academic colleagues will appreciate, is when we go out to, and I'm tempted to talk about interdepartmental stuff, but I'm not going to do that. But when I thought about I think about going out and getting a grant. So, for instance, if I'm going to go to the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art and apply for some kind of a grant, or they've offered a grant, right? Maybe they have a $50,000 grant to assess, some of the cultural dimensions of your patrons and how they interact with art. And I want that grant. I mean,
So do I.
but there are a lot of things that can happen if you get a nice grant. But if she's the person providing the money, again, as Marty said, I have to build that trust with her. She has to know that I'm serious, that I understand what's going on, and that means I have to really listen for the right questions and all of those things. So probably every grant that I've ever received has started really with good listening, or trying to be a good listener, with the person who's providing the grant, holding the money.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Going off of what they both said, from a fundraising development standpoint, it's building the relationships with the donor, potential donor, and finding out what their interests are, and going from maybe it's just starting at a base level of a membership, and then finding out if they prefer children's programming, or they'd prefer just to be a member versus giving to the annual fund, and then working them into hopefully a planned giving, or down the road they become they can put their name on a gallery down the road and they leave us a legacy gift. But it's building those relationships and getting to know what their interests are. So it's definitely listening. And I'll take that grant whenever you're ready. So.
No, I'm taking the grant. You got the money.
Someday.
I've always wanted to be adopted by a billionaire. So, Danielle?
So, I think that one thing that's really emerging from our conversation so far is the role that listening plays with relationship. And so, I mentioned that my area of study is performance studies, and what I look at is how creative forms of communication can be used for problem solving, community building, and personal and social transformation. And I think in all of those things, being able to listen so that you can develop a relationship is so important. If you're going to engage in problem solving, I think there's a skill that's actually related to like performing on a stage, right? So you read a script, you have to perform the words on the page, but you also have to be able to perform the subtext. And so you have to read for both. And similarly, if you're engaging in problem solving, you have to listen both to what people are saying, but also to hear what the deeper desire and need is underneath that. And so I think that, what's sort of emerging for me is how important listening is to relationships and relational building.
It sounds like in those situations, you're really asking people on both sides of what might be a performance divide to take risk, especially the
Absolutely.
performer, right?
And you can't do that without trust.
Right.
And I think that then listening is such a necessary part of that trust building.
Yeah.
And, really isn't that different than like whether it's sales or like, fundraising. All of those situations really require, okay, how do I listen to both what people are saying and to the underlying need or desire or pain point, right?
Yep.
And the one other element that you're all saying is engagement. You can't do it without engagement either. Mm-hmm. That's the essence of the relationship.
On both sides.
Yeah, right, on both sides. How can you provide, or will you, I should say, provide an example of when effective listening helped you solve a conflict?
Oh, I can speak to that right away. The conflict in sales, one of the bigger conflicts in sales is price. Yeah. Okay, so the customer, first of all, typically, wants to know what's this going to cost me. That's one of the things that salespeople have to battle in a discussion. Is listen, I don't want to hear it all. Just tell me what it's going to cost. And in the head of a salesperson, that's the conflict, right? Is like, do I just tell them what the price is and, move on with my life? So, in order to resolve that conflict, you have to understand, what's really the customer, what's the problem? Do they want the lowest price, or do they want to get value for what they're paying for? So when, you hear somebody immediately talk about price. I always tell my students, I say, hey, when somebody's wanting the lowest price or wanting to know what the price is right away, you need to counter back that, in order to give them the best price, they have to fully understand what the problem is. In order to understand the problem, they need to ask some questions and listen to what the prospect has to say about their needs. So conflict is always defined in my world as, what is it exactly that the customer is objecting to, or the prospect is objecting to.
What about if it's time in your situation? They don't have time to listen to all the needs and that sort of thing because they've already heard it all.
Well, when someone says, I don't have time, again, you got to drive back to value, okay? Because, you can say to a customer, well, if I spend an extra hour with you and save you $1 million, would that make that time worth it? And so you really have to get the customer to understand that, if there's going to be, and hey, some customers just don't want to give you the time, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you do when that's, in communication we have encoding and decoding. Mm-hmm. If you can't allow the time for that to occur, then it's not worth either party's, investment. So I tell students, well, if somebody's not willing to give you the time and you've explained why it's important, you just get up and move on because there's another person waiting that will give you the time. So that's kind of, how I look at that. You have to have willing participants, and some people just aren't,
Well, when I think of this question about, time can be a problem, right? There can be a lot of things that can be a problem in trying to, and I'm going to go to what Danielle said, because listening ultimately is about creating a relationship. And usually it's creating a relationship that's not a pre-existing relationship, or in some cases it is anyway. And so from my training, for instance, in social work, one of the things that's part of various therapeutic models is you hear these things and you sort of think of them in terms of resistance, right? Oh, I don't have time, and so you kind of think of this is, and I think that's a healthy way to kind of conceptualize it because, and I'll just give you this example. Today I was talking to a state legislator about my disappointment with the way this person's political party handled a piece of legislation related to something I'm lobbying on, all right? Mm-hmm. And I actually went into the phone call feeling a little hostile, to be honest, or I don't know if hostile is the right word, but disappointed, right? And I think
hostile's the right word, Joe.
Well, I mean, we're talking about people's lives and trying to keep people from being shot to death. But when I went into that phone call, I understood that person was probably feeling the kind of same way because they know me well enough to know that sometimes I don't suffer fools gladly. I'm going to get. I want to get to the essence of the problem, and I want to solve it, right? But what I have to do in those circumstances, and there was some resistance from her. Okay, didn't mean to identify her, but we have a lot of state legislators in that. But there was some resistance, and it came out in the form of it's not the legislators who are the problem. It's the advocates who are the problem, and that you're not raising enough support and all of that sort of stuff. And when I heard that, and I've heard it many times, I kind of understood that what I have to do is start being more empathetic to where she is in this place, all right? That's the only way you break down resistance. You can't challenge it, okay? You have to be empathetic to it. And so what I try to do in those circumstances is, and it could be a time thing, I don't have time for this, I don't come on, then you've got to say, well, where is this resistance coming from? And usually, in most cases, it's coming from some kind of fear or anxiety. And
that's very true.
Yeah, and our job is to try to help them feel a little less. So I started saying things to this legislator that let her know I appreciate, and I do appreciate, many of the things that she's been done. And you know what? She started talking back about, well, we need to partner in better ways and things like that. And so it ended up well. So So I think, that's me. I kind of conceptualize these things as sort of resistance. And it makes sense that you'll have resistance when you're trying to build a relationship that's not pre-existing relationship, and you're trying to get people to take risk, buy this, or
right.
do these other things, or.
It's very insightful.
Yeah, I think that cultivating empathetic listening in the midst of conflict is an incredible skill, right? Not only can you generate empathy and listen from an empathetic space, but how do you also ask other people that are part of the conflict to, and invite them into the same sort of listening is, I think, a really unique challenge. And I think that asking thoughtful questions, I wonder, I'm really curious about this, can you tell me more, right? I think that asking questions is part of how you invite that, and how you ask the questions really makes a difference. I think that working in a theater, there's always good big drama before a show, and
Just not where you want it
right,
to be.
right, and I can sort of think about, it's not always on the stage.
What kind of drama?
What kind of drama? So
In the
I
green
think
room.
there might be disagreements between the cast on how something is handled. A lot of times.
Sure.
They're friends outside, and it makes its way to rehearsals, and yet you have a job to do. And so I can think of earlier this semester, even a conflict between two students, and I really felt as the person mediating that conflict is, how do I take a stand where stands need to be taken, while at the same time express that I've listened, I've understood, and I'm empathetic to both positions, because I was. And I think it's one thing to feel that way. It's another thing to, how do I communicate to express that? So because people always say oh, I don't feel listened to, right? Well, how do you know the difference? A lot of times it has to do with how someone performed listening back in a way that you received it.
And the asking questions, I think, is a really important thing, because it validates them, it lets them know, especially if you ask the right kind of question, it shows them you're listening. That's huge. Yeah. It always, but it all this, if we say it fast enough, it sounds kind of easy, but being in the midst of it, it's really difficult. And I always used to recommend to my students to try to practice empathy, to practice it, because we had this big debate in social work school: is empathy something that is innate? Some people have it, some people don't, or you can develop it. And I always came down on the side that you can develop it. But because at those moments when you need it and it's a conflicted situation, you'll be glad you have some of that capacity for doing it, for recognizing the need and carrying it out.
I think experience really is what you need in order to be more empathetic, because a younger person, might not understand why that's important or why it's necessary. But when you have 60 years under your belt, like certain person sitting here, it's I know the importance of it. I understand how to develop it in a conversation, and the other part of it is, for me anyway, it's genuine. I was raised by a Sicilian mother who was very caring and wanted to understand what exactly my problem was, and because of that, so I think a lot of empathy, a lot of skills that we all have or don't have, they evolved from how we were parented, how our parents raised us. So,
Joanne,
would you agree?
What do you do when somebody tells you they've given you $5,000 and you don't have the record of it?
Search like crazy.
Search like crazy.
Search like crazy. It's a matter of having the conversation with them, and hopefully they're local, hopefully having that face-to-face with them, and going back to what we were talking about earlier and finding out where their interests lie. Trying to, at that point, is probably reestablishing a relationship. And hopefully they're not too upset. I had a situation at a previous job where some checks, some deposits didn't get made, and those donors, their deposits didn't register with that organization. So there was quite the conflict, and it had to be handled by a higher up, but all those donors had to be contacted. That was obviously a difficult situation. So again, it was going back and talking to each of those donors. Thank goodness there weren't many of them, but it's a one-on-one relationship building, rebuilding at that point.
Sure.
But reinforcing the value of the organization, reinforcing why they're part of it to begin with, like we talked about. And I think you make a good point about how when it's more than just a one-on-one, when there's more people in the room, how much more challenging that gets as well. And that's a skill learned over time as well.
Do you have an example of when misinterpreting or misunderstanding a message led to complications?
Probably with my ex-wife would be my first impulse. But
I have that level of personal example.
But I've repressed it. I've repressed it. The only thing I remember about it was that it was her fault. Other than that, I'm kind of, and I think she remembers it exactly the reverse of it.
It being your fault.
Yeah, that's right. Where misinterpreting created a bigger problem. Is that basically?
Right,
yeah.
correct.
I think that can happen in circumstances like, Joanne mentioned. If you're talking with someone who really has the resistance going because they don't want to talk about this at all, right? And they may be sending out mixed signals, all right? So in those circumstances, I'm not so sure I'm sure I had some with students, particularly students who, they'd miss an exam and they had a bogus reason for it and they're trying to kind of just shine you on and things. But
and then they tell other people you won't let them take the exam, and then they spread it. And
yeah. But I'm trying to think. I probably have repressed instances where I've misinterpreted something because of not very good listening. But I'm sure that if that happened, that was because I wasn't listening well. And that's the thing, listening is hard work. It's really tough. And, when I would send my students out to interview criminal offenders at the residential facility, I refused to let them go over 40, 45 minutes at the max because you just get exhausted, And so...
I once had a psychologist tell me that if she was doing her therapy over the phone, she could only do that once a day, and this is before Zoom, because she was listening so hard, she was exhausted,
right,
purely exhausted, and she could do that only once a day because she couldn't see with her eyes, and she was listening so hard to the words and the nuances of the words, because there could be misunderstandings, and that she would have to catch those and ask more questions.
Again, I think for me, I think about my work as a union advocate here on this campus, and whenever I would say I'm representing an employee or during union negotiations, something like contract negotiations, I think the problem whenever I would and that's the great thing about bargaining is because you're in a committee and people can say, Joe, chill, you got that wrong there, bud. Or they can tell you later or something, right? But I think for me, the problem, again, it sort of comes back to empathy, is when I have a presumption about the other person's motives, right? And so once I have that presumption about their motives, they might say something that is, completely neutral or has a total different value than what I've assessed. And so I just think it gets back to that point of view you have of the person that you're interviewing, I think.
Danielle, I think this question particularly could go to gender studies.
Absolutely. I was just
yeah.
thinking, about how so one of my areas of studies is gender and communication, and I was just thinking about a post that recently a friend had made on social media about, you know, kind of making a joke about, like, you know, why doesn't my husband just like know what it is that I want him to do, right? Like that, and like, is that like a listening conflict, right? Is that a misinterpretation? And how often too that the way that we've been taught to listen and pay attention is in fact gendered, that there's different socializations around that. And so I was thinking about after I had my kiddo, I was dealing with postpartum anxiety. My husband has ADHD that, of course, when you aren't sleeping gets even more intense. And then the domestic tasks become more and more difficult. And how, you know, kind of the motives, I would sort of be like, well, why aren't you helping with this?
Right.
Like, don't you see me? Like, and then I don't want to have to ask for that, because that's just more labor on my end, right? I want you to just like see and know that this is what I need, but sort of also not recognizing that maybe, again, there's something else going on there that, you know, particularly if you're neurospicy, right? You have, you're neurodiverse, right? There's certain things that I might interpret as, you know, him just not doing, when actually that's just a symptom of, you know, ADHD. And so I needed to sort of learn how to listen to, oh, you didn't sleep well last night. Okay, now I know what maybe you're seeing or not seeing in terms of things happening around you, because I've learned a lot about how your brain works, right? And that you do, like in relationships, whether that's at work or whether that's, you know, partnerships, you know, you have to kind of take the time to learn how each other's brains work, so that, you know, you can understand how they listen. And to also recognize that there might be times that you need to communicate what your needs are in a way that it can be supported and received by others. And like, how do you learn that skill and not necessarily expect that somebody else has that skill to just be able to read what you're doing? Because I know, I think about that a lot as our classrooms have been more neurodiverse and having a lot more autistic students in my classroom. Like, how I communicate has to shift, because the way they listen is different. I might have a student, I might say something that they take incredibly literally. And I'm like, well, why haven't you turned in this paper? And you're like, well, you told me I just don't want to see it if you can't turn it in by this date. I'm like, no, I still want to see it. you know, they take it really literally, and I didn't, you know. So I think that, you know, recognizing too that there's all these different things, whether it's gender or our neurodiversity or whatever, that's going to impact the way that we can listen. And then how do you learn what might be impacting other people's ability to listen and adjust and adapt to that?
So the potential for misinterpretations are sometimes just part of the context. It just comes with some particular territory. Maybe not so much in a business arrangement, but maybe more so in a friendship or a marriage, you know, that kind of thing. Maybe not so much in fundraising, but, you know, other circumstances.
Well, I have a girlfriend whose English is her second language. So, you know, she speaks English really well. She teaches here, and you know, she'll say something, and I won't know, like, the interpretation is totally, like, I've listened to her, I've heard her, but she meant something totally different, you know. And a lot of it deals with our slang, you know, because a lot of foreigners who learn English as their, you know, second language, they got the basics down, but then there's all our slang that, you know, comes at much later intervals, you know. So, you know, she'll say something to me, and there's incredible misinterpretation, you know, and the you know, the key when that happens is, you know, how do you, typically it's a frustrating situation, you know, because it's like, I know exactly what you said, but that's not anywhere near what you meant, you know. So those types of things are always going to be a, you know, something to have to deal with.
You're the one that's interculturally diverse, not your girlfriend.
Explain.
Because you're the one from a different country. She isn't.
I see your point there. Yeah. Yeah.
But just what I just
That's a really good
say on
point.
this and go back and say is that, when we talk about listening, well, what are we listening to? We're really listening on two levels. We're listening on a cognitive level for information, logical relationships, problem solving, but we're also listening, whether we know it or not, and probably not as well as we can, on an emotional level, right? And so if I'm talking to someone who's autistic, or I remember once when I was a parole officer, I had a parolee who was deaf. And one of the things I learned about people who are hearing impaired is they get emotionally frustrated right away.
Oh,
Okay,
wow.
or not right away. I mean, he did in his case, and he it's kind of a. But you have to sort of take into account always. This is where empathy comes in: is what's going on emotionally here with this person. And I would just assert that in most cases, people, if you're having trouble communicating with someone, both one of the parties, or maybe both of the parties, has anxiety and fear. Now, if we're the sort of people, if we're sort of like in charge of the situation, like with the fundraisers or something, then it's more incumbent upon us to be empathetic about that. It wouldn't be a situation which you would say, for instance, if you're trying to raise $100,000 from Danielle, and there's a kind of a deal there, right? Okay, something's not going right. It's not going to be appropriate for you to say, Danielle, this is making me kind of uncomfortable. I don't know if you can feel how this is for me. Instead, so it's difficult to bridge all that stuff. I don't think you would probably do that with your students. You might in some circumstances. You might do that with students, but so somehow we have to decode this emotional content, okay, which will contribute to misinterpretations of the cognitive content. And that's really hard. And we're going to get it wrong a lot of times,
Yeah, we will. And there are many, many examples, I think, of where we've all gotten it wrong. I was telling a student one time that this was not her best work, and she was capable of much more, but I knew she was going through some health concerns. I got called on the carpet because I made her more anxious for coupling the health concerns with the grade. And she was right to call me on the carpet about it because it created more anxiety in her. But I did not realize that coupling the grade and her health would cause that. We get it wrong.
That's right.
But we don't get it right unless somebody tells us. And that's the whole instance.
Also is part of
the intent, yes.
Your intent wasn't.
No, my intent was
that.
not, and she realized that. But she wanted for the future that I would know that she couldn't handle that. And I said to her, "Thank you for telling me. I applaud you for being able to come and tell me that." I felt lousy that I had done it, but to cause the anxiety. But I knew my intent was what it was. But you're right, Joe, we always make mistakes, but it's all about learning. And listening, I think, is an active process, which is a learning process for all of us. Do you have an example of when you were actively listening and it improved your decision-making process or your outcomes? Joanne, I think this might be one that you could, because it's tangible.
Again, back to the museum, and the first thing that comes to mind is soliciting sponsorships for our one and only fundraiser, which is a gala that we.
And I'm sorry, how much do you want to try and raise? I know it's varied every year, but
it's over $100,000.
Okay. See Danielle.
Thank you. But every year we have well over 35 sponsors, corporate sponsors, for this. So it's a matter of going back to previous sponsors and trying to bump them up, if you will, to a higher level. But it's a matter of, and we go through the same list every year, but it's a matter of listening to what they said the previous year. Some of them want to be taken off the list. Some of them, not this year, but next year I'll go up higher. And a lot of the players change from year to year. So it's a matter of reminding them, this is what was said, this is what we can do for you. This year, it's selling the attributes, more or less. Yep. And this is how you're helping the arts and children's programming, if that's what is of interest to them. So it's going back in and listening and reminding and having that one-on-one, building the relationships or rebuilding. Yeah.
How does it help you sell?
So the outcome's always like your bank account for a salesperson, you know.
Oh yeah, your ROI.
It really is. Whether it's your company or whether it's you personally, you know. I mean, that's the best way. Like when you asked the question, I was like, yeah, best way is like looking at your bank account or your numbers every month. If you are, actively listening, at least in the sales world, that typically equates to success, and success typically is defined, as more sales, more revenue, more income, more commission, and that's just the way it works, in my world, so.
Okay.
So I have a podcast, and one thing that I wouldn't have necessarily thought about prior to podcasting is how important the role of listening is to kind of all of it. So, I have an audience that I speak to, and so much of it is asking them about their experiences, listening to what they say back, and then I literally create content. It's fine. I literally create content using the words that they've shared back to me. And, that's also really what search engine optimization is.
That's totally
it's,
yeah.
You just listen to the words that people have, like what are the words that people are using, what are the words that they're searching, and then how do I create titles and descriptions that are like speaking back to their needs and their concerns and their desires. And so, when I think about, performance work, I think it's really similar to, like, if you want to meet your audience's expectations, right? You have to know what their expectations are, and you don't learn that unless you listen. Mm-hmm. And then it's really, how do you sort of compose content that matches and is speaking the language that they speak, the words and the dialect and everything. So, yeah.
I think that reflecting back what you hear, sometimes it's called mirroring.
Yeah.
What you hear is so powerful, or clarification is so powerful, because it lets a person know you're listening, and it also tells you when you're off track, right? And I'm not, second to empathy, I'm not sure that there are any tools more important than being able to do that. Was your question about how listening solve problems just now? Was that,
How does your decision-making process or outcomes affect?
And I think about it, and I heard you guys were talking a while ago about your kids, but I have a 9-year-old, and one of the things that having a small child, and I'm a much better parent now than I was, say, 45 years ago, because I'm a better listener, right? Mm-hmm. Because I'm a better listener, but it's easy to dismiss kids,
God, that's so true.
It's easy, but I don't think a day goes by that my kind of active listening to my son doesn't solve a problem of some kind. It's largely an emotional problem, but it's, like he's upset or he's angry about something. He wants to play Fortnite, and I've told him why he can't do it, right now, and that kind of thing. And he gets upset, and, we just have to calm, we do it with our kids, we calm it. And also with adults, too many adults are infantile, all right? and sometimes we have to think about treating adults like your 8-year-old. And it's maybe an unkind thing to say, but it's reality. You dealt with it, where people are just, they're and you've got to find a way to comfort them and help them feel better, and but I'm always amazed at how much listening helps me be a better parent. That's like a big thing right now in my life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It goes with animals too, right, Joanne?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's great.
You have a furry child.
20-pound cats, yes.
But it does. That's a great point. It does go with animals. It really does. Yeah.
Yes.
Joe, I'm going to go to you for this next question. I'm going to go to you first because I think your field and it really is on target with this question. How do you stay calm and objective when listening to emotionally charged messages, especially in the criminal justice system or the legislative system?
Well, part of it is to try to plan what you're going to do. Okay, so try to anticipate what's going to happen in this exchange. So if you're working with performers and you know that today's the day we're going to talk about that really, difficult scene or something, part of being able to stay calm in it is to think about what's likely to happen and how you want to respond to it so that you can anticipate it doesn't take you by surprise. And I think that's a big thing. I've faced a lot of situations with offenders where it was just a matter of, again, letting them know they're being listened to, I used to say to juvenile offenders when they go crazy on me, I'd say, I can't hear you because you're screaming so loud. If you could just take it down some where I could hear you better, And those kind of little tricks, that makes a big difference. People want to know they're listened to. And I don't know if that's a response, but that's the best I've got. So.
Yeah, a lot of it is the tone of your voice. And when, that question, I laugh because I'm from the East Coast and spent a lot of time in New York City and Philadelphia, and I'm an emotionally charged guy. So when there's those situations, like it's really difficult for me not to go toe to toe with somebody that's emotionally charged. And I think in my again, this is another experience thing. As I've gotten older and wiser, I've just learned that, even just like not so much talking like I am now, but slowing it down to almost a whisper can take all of the emotion out of someone's, situation and concern, when they're coming at you hot-headed. If you can literally lower your normal speaking voice, a number of decibels down, it changes the whole situation,
And this is something many law enforcement officers are just terrible at, but it is gendered, okay? And I think we're learning more in law enforcement about how to not have to assert some kind of masculine domination over a situation, but instead to give that person, to have a sense of understanding for that person that they're under stress. They're afraid, right? And respect that. And I'm inclined to say that women in law enforcement are better at that than men. Because that's a generalization, but I will say that although women are underrepresented in the field, even at the level of representation, we don't see as many excessive uses of lethal force that we would expect from women as we do from men. So,
that's true.
But on the whole, even like in law enforcement, I think the big part of it is sort of trying to be prepared for what's going to happen, right?
That's true.
I know that if I'm feeling really emotionally charged and I need to listen, because I think that what happens sometimes is when I'm in that emotionally charged state, I get in my head. I'm thinking about my response.
Yeah.
I'm in a reactive state instead of a responding state. And I know that in some ways what I need to do is I need to slow my own physical reactions down. And in order to do that, I need to come back into my own body and kind of get out of my head some. And so I think like I love the suggestion of just like lowering your voice, because it's a physical thing that you can do that can, you know, really change the situation. I really like to kind of connect with my breath is a really important one. I know sometimes, you know, people will give the countdown from, you know, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know, another thing that's just really helpful for me is I've started practicing just going, There's like something about that like moves you into like a more like curious state. It's like a nice little vibration in your throat. But to kind of go, I wonder like what's going on here. I'm curious about this. And that kind of to go, I'm feeling angry right now. I wonder, you know, what's going on. Kind of, I think, reminds me to slow down. But I also think in doing that is a cue for me to be curious about what's going on with the other person, so that I can start listening from their perspective, not from my own. Because, you know, I'm in my own state of anger, and I think as long as I'm in a state of anger, fear, anxiety, it's going to be really hard for me to be able to take on a perspective of someone else.
No, I really like it. It's almost like when you do, you're kind of asking yourself. It's almost like a little signal to you. What's this?
Yeah.
What's this? And I really like that. That's great.
It allows you to take a step back before you go forward with it.
Yeah, trying to teach yourself to pause in a moment
I like that.
you don't want to. It's really hard.
Right. Well, that's the thing too, because when somebody's coming at you, like you want to come right back. At least that's how I am. And having the ability to like stop and like really ingest that moment, you know. And again, that pause is really a great idea. I am not good at these things.
I think in some ways that's why I had to add the you know,
love that.
because I want to respond, I want to react. I needed to give it emotion. I need my pause to have emotion, if that makes sense, so that it wasn't just still. That was curious.
Yeah. It's one of your students. Probably doesn't make
Not
it
sure
to
what
the
happened out
microphone.
there right now, but it didn't sound positive.
For the viewing audience, there was a scream outside, but I think they're practicing a play. So, but Okay, Danielle, I want to ask you this next question. And then, how do you manage distractions, such as we just had, when you're trying to listen? And this will especially apply because you have a podcast.
Yeah.
And what types of distractions do you find the most difficult to overcome?
So my podcast is called Plan, Goal, Plan, and a lot of what I work with people around with that is it's basically time management and personal development. And so distraction is a huge topic.
Oh gosh, yeah.
And right away when you ask that question, my first thought is I really think that our phones are such a huge distraction from our ability to listen. And what's interesting is as workplaces, for example, start using more and more technologies, because they do provide certain efficiencies, that those same technologies distract us, whether it's a ping of an email or the expectations that emails are answered so quickly. And then that prevents you from listening in a meeting because you're trying to answer your emails at the same time that you should be listening in a meeting. And so I think that some of the biggest external distractions right now are technologies and our unhealthy relationship to those technologies. And I think that affects us in the workplace. I think it affects us in our homes and our relationships. I think that then we have maybe some more internal distractions. And I think that that's a lot of the emotional things that we've been talking about, is that I think that we have these internal distractions of monkey brain.
So what do you do about it?
What do you do about the internal or external?
Well, I would say the external primarily, because with the internal, we just go, we
we got that
We've got that
covered.
part. But with the external distractions, and I used to talk with my students about this too, because sometimes they would do their interviews in places where there were. Well, have you ever had students do interviews in the union? I mean, I have, and there's nothing but distractions. So what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that personally, teaching ourselves healthy habits around our technologies and setting boundaries around that is wildly important. So whether, we definitely have some practices in my home, for example, of like, this is when you can have technology time, or even, myself, like I don't carry my phone between 5 and 7 usually at night, because if I have it, I'm going to pay attention to it instead of my kids. I get kind of frustrated sometimes in the classroom because I don't want to have my phone in the classroom. But right now, to even like log into our computers, I need it. And so, that's like, I think, how do we set boundaries, and when do we say, hey, now is a time that we're going to use this? There's even little tricks, like I guess there's a beautiful book called Bored and Brilliant by Manoush Amadori. And she writes about how even if you have your phone, like if you're at a restaurant, like you'll see people hanging out at restaurants and they'll have their kind of phones up, and they'll pick it up and they'll look at it, and how even just having your phone upside down instead of face up, that one, people would perceive you as being a better listener.
That's true.
Having it down, but that also you're less likely to reach for it. And so, I think a lot about how do we create habits and boundaries around that, and how do we do that individually, but then also, in workplaces, how might we create boundaries around what our expectations are, right? So if you have an expectation that people are going to respond to emails right away, then you're asking them to be distracted by email all day. And so how do we also create systems and boundaries in a workplace that allow people to have those healthy, or invite people to have more healthy relationships with their technologies, I think is really important.
Yes. In my current place of work, I totally agree with you. I think that boundaries need to come from the top. Often in a staff meeting, for instance, some of our, I'll say, younger employees that aren't very experienced yet will have their cell phones with them and will be checking email, and they are not corrected or anything. But they'll say, oh, I'm checking the work calendar for upcoming programs to discuss at the staff meeting. I don't think so. So in that sense, it needs to come from the top to set the parameters for the office. So because it's very distracting.
Print it out or write it out prior to the meeting.
Yes. So.
In some situations, Joe, you'll appreciate this. My son's a police officer, and when he was a rookie, he had a roadside stop on I-95 on the East Coast, and you can imagine it was during rush hours, really, so the distraction level was incredibly high. And police officers truly are, have to always be aware of everything, and distraction is like something that's, there are many different distractions coming at you, and he found himself in a battle of like a physical battle with someone, a guy who was had warrants out and had actually was tailgating his cruiser on in the passing lane, and he got in the center lane. The guy went flying by him. Guy had no awareness that he had just passed a marked police car, So my son,
he was
again,
pretty distracted.
Yeah, exactly, but my son tells me to this day, he's like, you know what, I had to learn a lesson in order to be more aware of how to deal with, a distraction. And so for him, it was, just the fact that he recognizes that he can lose his life, or there's something big at stake, I think, and you have to have a moment of failure to, you learn that behavior of, hey, if I continue this behavior, I'm going to have failure. And that translates right into the classroom where, again, if there's some type of distraction, you got to learn how to overcome it. And sometimes that's after you get an F on a paper because you weren't paying attention and, you didn't properly, get the lecture down, or in my son's case, a roadside stop where he had all these things going on around him, and it led to the guy trying to escape, and he nearly lost his life as a rookie. So.
Wow.
But I could just say something. So when I think about the type of listening and that we're maybe thinking about in general, this is an assumption on my part. But I'm thinking about listening. So for instance, in interviews or in context of working with students and things like that. And so for me, the distractions tend to come from the person paying attention to the person I'm interviewing anyway. So it may come from their body language, it may come from what they don't say, it may come from something behaviorally, right? I had this one student I talked to, and I ended up telling someone, but this guy, and he was one of these guys who was trying to find the path to least resistance. Even though he'd been on it all his life, he was dedicated to it, right? Yeah, and here's what he would do when he'd come in and talk with. I had him doing some assignments, and he didn't want to do it properly. He didn't want to. What he wanted to do was come in and sort of persuade me that he was a really good student, but then when he left, he wasn't doing the work, right? And so when he'd come into my office to see me, he would have steady, complete, unbroken eye contact with me during the entire discussion, okay? And so this was like a domination thing that he was doing. Very distracting, right? And, that's his thing. And actually, this is funny, an aside.
Super intimidating.
I met somebody on the staff at this university a couple years later who used to date this guy. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, she worked in a registrar's office, and she said,
Such an interesting conversation.
I know. But and you know what she said? Yeah, he does that. He did that with me all the time. But anyway, my point was, that's an aside. But my point was, what do you do in those circumstances? Well, it's kind of planning. You stick with the plan. Okay. You remember what am I trying to accomplish here? What's the information I need to have? And you just try to tune out the distractions,
right?
And it's not easy, and some of those distractions aren't necessarily because, notwithstanding the example I just gave, some of those distractions are not because of resistance. They're just because, people's nonverbal communication isn't sometimes communication. It's just habits that they have and things, and or noises from down the hallway or those kind of things. And you just sort of have to, keep in mind, stay on this thing.
Sometimes my desire to have a plan is the distraction, though. That sometimes I can go into a communication interaction and I can have it in my head like, I have an agenda, right? Like I've got a plan here, and instead of actually listening, I might so sometimes actually my plan can be the distraction.
Yep.
Because instead of me listening and adapting to the situation at hand, I sometimes might be a little too committed to my own plan, and then that can be the distraction sometimes too. So I got to be careful of that.
Balance, 'cause that cuts you off from surprises that you would otherwise have that can be pretty enlightening. But you're right. I have the same thing, But sometimes we're time crunched. Right, you've got to get this thing done, and so sometimes we're pretty task centered on what we have to do, and
isn't that a lot like when someone's talking to you and you're planning the answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just like, how do you balance that, right? You want to, you want to respond right away, but they haven't finished their thought, and it's a real how do you pull that off? It's challenging, I think.
What kind of specific nonverbals do you think help you listen? Nonverbals of the other people. Which nonverbals help you listen and interpret the message?
In Joe's case, having a gun pointed at you.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
That would get my attention. But I think eye contact's really important, and I think body posture, all those sort of things we sort of learn about listening, I think they're all important, I think. But
Vocal tones.
yeah.
I actually think, you were talking about mirroring earlier,
Yeah.
that a lot of times it's not only just the nonverbals, so, whether it's nodding or leaning in or making eye contact at the right amount, right? That I think part of it is how people respond, and are they responding in a way that indicates that not only were you heard, but you were understood.
Yes. That's right. Which goes to sometimes repeating back what they said, as you were referring to a while ago, that kind of thing. It's really powerful. I mean, just those little head nods are powerful, right?
Yeah.
They really are. Okay.
No, they are. No, I agree with you. I look for them.
But I think the eye contact, and one of the things I teach my students, I used to say is that eye contact is something too that it's important to break eye contact at the right moments, because breaking eye contact is a signal that I'm finished talking, or it might be it's my turn to talk, that kind of thing. And so I'm big on the eye contact part of it.
Stephen Covey has the 5 levels of listening, and one of them is pretending. I think it's number 3. And in the sales world, a prospect that's used to seeing and hearing a lot of salespeople will, give you the nod and shifts forward in their seat and acts very like really, really interested, and you walk out of there thinking, wow, that was a great call, and then they never you can never get in touch with them again, and so you always got to be wary of of that body language faking you out, and I have a number of students that I think are pretty good at that, where I'm like, okay, really, a lot of head nodding in class, and then later on when you ask for the concept to actually be practiced, they're like, what, did you go over that? I'm like, well, you were the one nodding their head. That's why I called on you, So I think that's a challenge, and you can be faked out a little bit by some body languages, right? That are intended to deceive you, if somebody's smart enough and experienced enough.
My kids would call me out on my pretending. Right?
Seriously.
Really?
Oh yeah, like if you're, like if you're cooking or you're, you're doing a task and your kids are talking, you're like, like, like they're playing a game, I'm supposed to be playing princess or school, and but I'm also like doing the dishes, and I'm like, yes, and my kid will be like, no, Mom, like play with me. They know pretty quick that like I'm faking out all the signs of like listening and not really listening. So there is apparently, we do have some tells sometimes that we're doing the I'm a good listener thing, but not really listening. They can kind of tell back and they'll call me on it.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a princess, of course.
Of course.
I mean, if you're a 6-year-old princess, absolutely,
Well, my son today, when we're driving home, he wanted to show me what's in this book while we're driving. And I said, well, do you have this?
Yes.
I said, I can't look at that. Yeah. And sometimes it'll happen. He said, Dad, you're not listening. Well, driving.
Oh. Well, and I do think that sometimes, even as adults, we'll say like, you're not listening to me, and what we really mean is you're not doing what I want you to do. And I think that got sometimes that's a hard thing, because I think there's times where we say like, I want to be listened to, and I'm not being listened to, and like really actually it's that this person isn't doing what I would want them to do, and learning how to communicate that. It's easier to say back like, oh, well, you're not listening to me, than to go like, hey, well, you're not doing what I want you to do. But like, that's oftentimes how we feel, and I think that matters.
That's true. How do you accommodate for cultural differences?
Well, I think first of all you have to recognize it. You have to recognize they're there. I think that's the starting point.
Yeah,
you have to recognize it.
really,
You have to, again, something that I would talk with students. So many of our students here in Iowa who are interested in criminal justice are white, and so many of the probationers and the parolees and others that they will be interacting with on an official basis are not. And by the way, there's this class thing as well. But I think first of all, you just have to recognize that it's there, and gender as well. You know. So I used to say to my student, I said, I'll pick some 20-year-old white criminology student in my class as male and say, so what's going to happen with you if your interviewee is a 45-year-old African American woman who just got out of her second bit in prison? Okay. You think that's going to be something that you're going to be comfortable with from the beginning, right? Well, of course it's not. So first of all, you just have to recognize it. And some people, and I think particularly in criminal justice, want us to pretend those differences aren't there, right? Yeah, but they're there. So I think that's the first thing. And I think also becoming kind of culturally aware, learning, learning about other cultures.
That's it for me. In Japan, you're not supposed to look your supervisor in the eye. You imagine, how that would be interpreted here in America. So to your point, understanding, just invest the time and effort into understanding the differences. And being American, we think that we lead in everything. We lead the league in everything, and we're the ones that are always right, and we do everything the right way. And I think again, I love to have my students invest in learning about other places, other cultures, other ways of living, because our way isn't necessarily viewed as the right way, for the rest of the world. And I think it's important to have a little humility as Americans, to recognize that there's a lot more out there than just here, and that's a challenge for our kids here in the Midwest, right? Because most of them come from a little small town and they come into big city of Cedar Falls, Iowa, and frankly, they have it all figured out by the time they're in their last year of college, and there's a lot more to the world than here. I always recommend study abroad, because I think that's a really valuable way for them to get that, cultural difference and understanding thereof.
I'm working with a program that's about 90 to 95% international students right now, and so many of the conflicts that emerge, I do think, are from not understanding cultural differences. So, we, had a student who, in their culture, it isn't a practice to look in the eyes. And, a person working in the office was like, why aren't you listening to me? And they were like listening, but that was actually their sign of respect.
Exactly.
Other example was, we had a student who marked on their application that they're very interested in domestic violence. So we placed them in the Violence Prevention Center. At the time, had 2 male supervisors. This was a student from a Middle Eastern country where being alone with men.
Yeah, no.
And yet that was, on paper the right place to place someone given their interests, but how do you navigate that? I had a student who I couldn't understand why she wasn't getting along with an instructor, or didn't really want to engage with one of the instructors. It really didn't make sense because she was from Iran, Well, she was an Afghan refugee to Iran and then came here. And as an Afghan woman who had fled to Iran, had experienced a lot of prejudice being a refugee there. And so here I'm like, oh, well, this person's Irani. You're like, you all will like have connections and actually like, duh. You know, like once I thought about it, but it took me a while to understand, like I could feel the tensions in the communication interaction, but I didn't understand where the tensions were coming from. And, you know, it took me a little bit of time to sort of recognize and to like learn sort of the histories there. And it's you know, it's really, really complicated, or sometimes I think that you can learn some of those things, but the intricacies of the cultural practices are so much deeper than, you know, probably my surface level learning was.
But I want to say something on that. I think this is really important because I think part of this is, Gayle, I think you have to try to be cultural aware, which means going into an interview with someone who comes from a completely different place that you do, you should anticipate going into that. Now, my younger self didn't do this. I'll tell a story on myself in a second, but you have to really anticipate that these type of differences you just described, I mean, you didn't know specifically what they were there, but you have to be aware that there's going to be something that is a potential, you know, impediment, significant emotional impediment to us being able to have a bridge between each other. So you have to sort of recognize and be ready for it in a way. And I think that, and I think this is especially important for a global listening center because we are becoming more global, obviously, for the last 40 years. And not only that, but within democracies, such as or democratizing societies, there is so much fluidity among identities and how people self-identify, and then what their expectation is for how they're treated. Okay, and what does that mean? That means we are going to get it wrong, you know, and you're not even going to know you get it wrong. So I think part of it is just to understand that this is, you know, we're in the midst of, it's continuing kind of turbulence in these kind of identity shifts and such, and cultural, porous cultures the way they are. And we just kind of have to give ourselves a break, be willing to learn, and, you know.
Be forgiving.
And have a good intent. That's the most important thing. That's a good intent. What you were trying to do is help that person or whoever placed them. Their intent was to help them, okay? Your intent wasn't to marginalize them and put them in a bad situation. That's a big difference, right? So I think having a good intent and expecting there to, you know, so you don't you don't beat yourself up when this surprise comes up.
Well, and the other piece of that is, you know, could the student have sat down and, like, did they feel comfortable enough sharing that information, you know? And a lot of students, especially foreigners, I would imagine are really like, I don't want to bring that up. I'm not sure how that's going to be interpreted, you know, and
often a lot's at stake, and so they don't want to create any conflict.
That's right.
And I think that that's where listening comes in, because it's how do you pay attention enough that even if you don't know what the cultural things are that are going on, if you're listening and paying attention enough to recognize at least there's a tension, then you can invite the conversation. Hey, I felt like a little bit of a tension there.
Yeah.
Like, you know, can you tell me a little bit about that? Or you can, like there's ways that you can invite that conversation so that they don't kind of have to take it on. And so I think that sometimes it's just like paying attention, and even if you can't name it, to be able to at least name something's weird here, you know? Like, what's up?
Right.
Also,
Kind of a vibe that's not good.
I think also having a soft and inviting presence of your own, okay? So that they don't, because, you know, going back to the nonverbal, you know, we can communicate nonverbally to somebody and you can be uncomfortable in those situations because you know that, or you have an intuitive sense anyway, that this is going to be intense. And so you really have to take a moment to check yourself and try to be relaxed and show with your body language, your eye contact, your tone of voice, a caring, kind of a caring, let them know that they're safe. Again, very easy to say, especially if you're in the process of trying to collect information from someone.
I used to work in a program, and it was on the weekends, where there would be a great deal of international folks in the program. And at the time I was either teaching conflict or negotiation. And I would invite those folks, or anyone, to talk about where they were from. I didn't care if they were from Kansas or they were from Liberia. And to talk about it and to talk about their experiences. And we had a really rich discussion and would compare and contrast their experiences. And so we would use that as a base for how to handle conflicts. And we would get into some pretty heavy discussions. We'd also get into some pretty funny discussions. Like a Liberian gentleman once said, "Why do you all eat rabbit food here?" And we're going, huh? Oh, salads. And, you know, he got into some pretty bad legal trouble because he asked a girl out several times and she said no. She took out a restraining order and he still kept asking her. But this is how you did it in Liberia. Mm-hmm. You went on and on and on for a year, and then his best friend asked, and then she finally said yes. In this country,
no is no.
If you keep no is no, and so he got picked up.
Wow.
So it's different, you know, and he didn't understand the cultural differences, and we talked about all of that. So if you ever have a chance, this was just a situation where we did have this opportunity to discuss all this. It was very rich conversation about the cultural differences and bringing out the conflicts that occur because of that. Mm-hmm. And it opened up the eyes of us, the United States people, thinking, oh wow, what if we go to Liberia? What if we go to Saudi Arabia? And, you know, of course for a woman that's not a good idea to go to Saudi Arabia if you're in a non-American zone, because you really get some hassles. But it is, and it could have changed by now, but it's that type of research that you need to do in order to connect with people, to understand their process. And I'm also finding that your profession, your professional area, causes you to think in a very specific way, and people don't understand you a lot of times because of your professional area, unless you choose to let them in. Mm-hmm. So that's something. But how does listening change when communicators are in a virtual context? I think that's important in today's world. That's an important question.
It's just easier to tune out. I take some classes, some Hebrew classes on like this kind of thing where everybody's online, right?
Mm-hmm.
The teachers in Israel, right? It's very easy to tune out. I mean, you know, for anybody, you know, that's for me the biggest thing, right?
When I'm teaching a Zoom class and, you know, the camera's turned off, you know, I just really struggle with that. And, you know, so I have a policy where it's like, you know, if you're going to be in a virtual environment, at least, you know, be as present as you can be, right? You know, so turning off the camera, muting, you know, your laptop or whatever device you're using. I mean, it sends a message to me, and it could be totally inaccurate. Mm-hmm. But the message that I have when I see that is, you're checked out. You know, mm-hmm. That's, again, it could be 100% inaccurate, but, you know, I have no cues to tell me that you're engaged and you're listening, or at least, you know, here, you know. And, you know, of course, you know, that level of anonymity, it suggests a deeper problem that, you know, you're not a great student, or you just don't care. And again, all those things can be 100% inaccurate, but so I try to insist that the conversation be as real as it possibly can be, and I was in a long distance relationship, so the video calls, versus chat, the level of when you're chatting, I think we all can agree to this. You look at a sentence and you infer the emotion in those words, and it's fraught with peril, as I like to say. It really, really is. And you can also manipulate the conversation by purposely, injecting a statement that somebody's going to interpret that as oh, they're mad at me, or or they're okay with this, and the fact is they're not. So the more we live in this virtual environment where we can be as close to reality as possible, obviously I think we all would agree that's probably the way to go.
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to you lose some of the nonverbals, and it's harder to read people. It's harder to really hear what people are saying or intending, especially when there are a lot of people on a Zoom call or whatever. So because people tune out or things like that. So I think it's more difficult.
Yeah, I think how you communicate that you're listening is a little different, right? Like in Zoom, I think that, maybe it's, utilizing the emojis, or it is making comments in the comment section. And I do think that even as a speaker or a facilitator, you have to change the way that you communicate in those environments. So I hold webinars and workshops in Zoom a lot, and it is different than my in-person classrooms, where I think that I would say you have to ask for engagement at least every 2 minutes, right?
On Zoom or in
on
class?
Zoom.
Yeah.
So if I'm on Zoom, I think that I have to ask for engagement. I have to move to you a lot more frequently, and I have to say, hey, if this is really connecting with you, put, connect in the comments. Or if this, if you've ever had this happen, I want you to give me the thumbs up emoji. And I think I have to request engagement as a speaker in a way that I don't in face-to-face communication, because I am getting that. And, I do think that in virtual settings, on both sides, whether you're how you demonstrate that you're listening and how you demonstrate or how you ask for engagement has to shift just a little bit in order for that to make sense. I know I was thinking about with text messages, my family is notorious for sending a bajillion texts, and then everybody will like everybody's text. So then you have 32 notifications, and half of them, there's only 5 messages that were actually sent. And my students have told me, they're Danielle, that's an old person thing. That's a generational thing, that somebody sends you a message and that we give it back. And I think that's how I think I've just been taught to say, hey, I received this, I'm responding to it. And I think that it is a little bit different generationally there too. And I don't research this that much, but I'm kind of fascinated a little bit about, what is it that, how then are they communicating, hey, I got this, I saw it, because I do think that, at least my generation, we're responding to everything.
Think about this for a minute. When you get a voicemail, 20 years ago, I got a voicemail on my phone, I'm all in. Now, the moment I see there's a voicemail, I dread having to listen to it. You know, I'm like, why didn't that person just text me, you know? So, you know, again, this technology has evolved.
So aggressive, someone's calling you.
Yeah.
I don't know that number. Yeah.
And then you see the voicemail. Oh my God, you know, what could this possibly be? You know, must be something incredibly unimportant, you know, because they would have texted me if it was important.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marty. I left your voicemail.
These are facts.
I think with this stuff, for some reason, I just imagine you're like in a one-on-one situation, and you and I are communicating, and you're, say, in Spain, and I'm in the States, and we're on Zoom, right? There's something about that I think, at least for me, sort of makes it more difficult for both parties to make a connection or to demonstrate a sense of real listening or empathy, you know? Mm-hmm. I don't know, is that just me or?
I don't know if you're asking me, I think it's perception.
It's perception. I mean,
that it's more difficult to make a connection.
Yeah.
I think it depends. You know, like I just got done having like a master class with about 10 women where, you know, we were talking, called Break Free from Busy, and we were like talking about like how to combat busy culture, right? And these folks, none of them knew each other prior to this gathering. It was 5 weeks, so 5 sessions. And, you know, by the end of it, they felt like really good friends. They were wildly supportive of each other. People were like crying, like, you know, with gratitude. And so, I mean, I will say though, it was a small group. It was 10 people and under. It created, you know, there was like, I think that there was like a sense of intimacy and connection through that. But there are also a lot of active engagement, both people, you know, like responding. So it wasn't like I was just talking. Everybody was engaging, and they were commenting in the chat. And then they were like loving each other's chat comments and, you know, things like that. And so I do think that it's possible, but I do think that it takes a different skill. And I do think that there is a way in which you have to like listen for the vibe in different ways when it's virtual. That like it's how you feel it in face to face is different. But like I do think that it's harder to construct that.
I agree. That's the thing. So in the example that you gave, Danielle, so the conversation is not specifically like task centered. Here's this thing, and we have to do this. Really more interpersonal. It's about sharing your feelings. How do we get out of busy culture? What is busy culture to me? Okay, I'm gonna take a risk and say that. You're gonna accept it. And so you've got all those things going on. So I can imagine relationships will come out of that might be, you know, more pleasant for everybody and more like what we experience, you know, and for instance in this kind of setting. But imagine that you're talking to someone in Manhattan who's going to give you a grant for teaching a certain type of model for theater or whatever. I don't know what you do, but okay. So, and now, you know, you really want to kind of get that situation where, you know, hey, I'm listening to you, right? And it's really task centered. It's not this other thing. It's, you know, or, you know, it seems to me that that's more difficult to do than if here's your funding source and you're talking with her like in the same room.
Do you find like selling online is harder?
Oh yeah, especially you know, my ex is a phenomenal salesperson, and here's an interesting fact: she would make her sales presentations without her camera on, and she's an attractive person. And her sales numbers were tanking, and her company did not. And there's 3 female salespeople, and most of the client prospects are males. Well, look. I mean, you know, I'm a real transparent guy, you know, and I kept saying to her, listen, as a guy, when I see I'm meeting with a female person, you know, I want the camera on, just natural curiosity. And she was very resistant to that sales call being, you know, as I say, as real as it can possibly be. And you know, she just was a naturally shy person, even though she was in sales, which you would find maybe hard to believe, but a lot of introverts in sales, they're actually really, really great listeners.
Yeah.
Introverted people are much better listeners than extroverts. And, you know, once I convinced her, you know, like, just muscle through it, for goodness sake, you know. And she started doing it, and like within 2 months, you know, her sales numbers were like 30-40% higher. So I think when you're dealing in a sales world where you're selling something, you know, you got to use all the assets you have. And, you know, even if she wasn't, you know, attracted to the opposite sex, I still would think you need this.
There's something about, like, kind of to go back to trust, what we
Oh,
kind of
that's
talked
it.
about
That's totally
at the
it.
beginning, like how you maybe develop a sense of trust shifts a bit in those situations. I mean, I think that teaching on Zoom is way harder than in person. I feel like I'm able to cultivate community so quick in a classroom,
Yes.
and it takes me a lot more.
Well, you know, something about what you just said made me think. The first book I read about body language, one of the things it points out something we all know, okay? It's different in different cultures, but we feel we have a different experience with someone if we're depending on our physical distance from them, right? Well, when you're talking to someone on Zoom, but like, I don't know how you teach, but when I teach, I walk around the classroom. You know, I walk around and I kind of close to students, and I, you know, so I'm, you know, I'm sharing that space with them, they're sharing it with me, which you can't do in Zoom. Something about that, right? And I don't think you can't replicate it virtually.
No, you can't.
Does it shake your confidence when
Absolutely, and I think it can shake. I think it can shake your confidence, and then that shifts how you're received. I think everything we were talking about, how much more challenging it is to listen, right? So, you know, if you're like, I don't know if people are listening or not. I don't know if I don't have those feedback. So I think if you haven't established, like, from the get-go, hey, this is how we're going to engage. Right? This is how you're going to give me feedback. This is how I'm going to give you feedback. I think that it can be really challenging because then you don't feel like you're getting feedback. So then you lose confidence, and then you fizzle out, and then they fizzle out even more. And yeah, I think it just dissolves.
But your defeating busy culture example sort of defeated that because you made emotional connection. Right? It became, in sociology, we would call it became a primary relationship as opposed to a secondary relationship because you guys became friends, right?
I think that one thing that helped too is that many of them found me through my podcast. So they had probably already hours of connection with me.
One way, but
right?
yeah.
So it was one way, like, for me, they were new, but to them, they're like, oh, we all know Danielle, right? Like, you know, I've listened to her talk for hours. And so I do think that makes a difference.
Yeah,
and I do think, you know, even though they didn't know each other, they all did kind of have, I would guess, some similar values because they were there, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, of course,
Yes.
it makes a big
You
difference.
as their main
Right.
connection.
Because
Yeah.
I felt like that was an easier thing for me to facilitate
Which you don't
than
necessarily
teaching
have
a
if
Zoom
you're,
class.
if you're
even.
selling something.
Right.
Yes.
You
Right.
don't
You don't have that
all the time have that.
Yeah.
But what this tells me is going back to I think the general question here is that to the extent it's possible to do it, if going again to this kind of emotional intelligence view, if in those virtual communication arrangements we can make some kind of pleasant emotional connection with someone and take the time to do that, maybe that makes it more real. I don't know, but that's, you know.
If you can, but I did this when we were during COVID, and they didn't have a graduation, and I got all the public relations students together on Zoom, and Ryan, our department head, was there. But it took about 3 hours, and we went through and we congratulated all of the students, and I spoke to each one of their strengths.
Right.
And the students loved it. I mean, they were
Yes,
about
it
in
was
tears,
cool.
and I had the parents there,
Really
and
meaningful.
if not a parent, a sibling or someone. But it took time, and I was exhausted.
Yeah, of course.
But they remember that, and a lot of them recorded it, because that was their graduation from this department.
Yeah.
And Ryan spoke, and it was wonderful, and they really liked it. We're running out of time very quickly. Are there any last minute thoughts?
Well, I learned some things here. I appreciate being here for what I learned from everyone, and so I think this is a topic where you have to keep learning. And you have to keep in this. I think this topic about the virtual type of interactions and knowing your own signals for when you're uncomfortable or whenever you need to put checklists. I think these things are really helpful for me anyway. So yeah.
As for me, the big challenge for me is, statistically, after 20 minutes, people check out. They stop listening. So I don't know, how long have we been at it here? So I'm like worried, have people stopped listening?
Well, you
Did they
folks
give up a while ago?
You folks are very engaging, and listening is. You all are in different. All 5 of us are in different fields, and I think it's very important to understand that listening is for everyone in every field, and that you've given a myriad number of examples. And I want to thank Danielle and Joanne and Joe and Marty for being here with us this evening. Yay! Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been
Thank
quite
you.
a pleasure. Well, thank you. It's been quite a pleasure. And thank you all for listening. It is a pleasure to be with the Global Listening Festival, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Good night. Goodbye for now.